instability of the case model. The passage of time liberates the still life from its total capture by the aesthetic. We see this in Gotanda's play. The economic power of the brothers becomes visible to them, most importantly, in the scene on the London stage, when instead of posing silently as Susan Coffin would like them to, they begin to speak to each other first and then to the audience. This is the beginning of their legal emancipation. It is also the moment from when they move from performing as still lives to performing the continuation, that is the still ongoingness of their life. I want to close then by talking about live and dead performance. Here are some images that you will presumably recognize from one of the many hugely successful and popular exhibitions that have appeared in major cities around the world since roughly the mid-90s. The exhibitions are variously known as Body Worlds or Bodies, the exhibition. There are a couple other names that depend on different corporations. The three images you have, these are bodies that have been stripped down to their muscle and bone thanks to a process known as plastination, in which the water in those tissues has been replaced by plastic, and then posed, in these cases, these three cases, these are all part of the Body Worlds exhibition by a man named Gunther von Hagens, who is the developer of this process. Or not the developer, but the major sort of figures who began to use this process for the exposure of these bodies. These bodies illustrate, it seems to me, once again, the problem of the display case, and the quotation that's on the slide is a quotation from the marketing material that belongs to the Body Worlds exhibition. Every human being is unique. Humans reveal their individuality not only through the visible exterior, but also through the interior of their bodies, as each body is distinctly different from any other. Position, size, shape, and structure of skeleton, muscles, nerves, and organs determine our interior face. It would be impossible to convey this anatomical individuality with models, for a model is nothing more than an interpretation. All models look alike and are essentially simplified versions of the real thing. And so I think in this measured kind of evaluation of the difference between these bodies and models, we get something like the paradox of the case. And the paradox of the case is, of course, that these bodies are not being asked actually to model or to perform for us anything like themselves or the being that is the mind that occupied them or that inhabited them and controlled them, but rather to actually illustrate human possibility, or in the case of the horse, horsely possibility, equine possibility, that is presumably universal. And in fact, much of the other discourse of these Body Worlds exhibitions is about the universal appeal of the individuality of the body. And so again, we have that kind of interesting paradox of the example, which is simultaneously unique and universal, just as Chang and Eng are simultaneously sort of unique, but also by lending their name to the term Siamese twins, become the kind of universal or fundamental example of something for which they are only actually, after all, an instance. The other thing that you need to know, I'll just show you this very quickly. The other thing that is true of these exhibitions is that they participate in the symbolic doubling that I've argued is so appealing about both twins and the aesthetic. This is a doubling that is historical, and it doubles deliberately the representation of an image from an Italian anatomical text of the 16th century. Here you see the sort of actual, the imagination, and in the anatomical text, of course, the skeleton, or the corpse, or pseudo, the skinless body is holding the knife, though Gunther von Hagens has removed that detail from his exhibition. The other thing you need to know about all these bodies is that they, at least in the first initial exhibitions, were all Chinese. And so one of the strange things about these exhibitions is that they speak to the nature of humanity, of all humanity, and of the interior face that we all share, and the individuality that we all share, while actually getting their bodies from a very specific national location and causing in various kinds of moments attacks and critiques that these bodies have actually been stolen from graveyards or are the corpses of prisoners, and have led to a series of claims and incidentally the production of a very large body plastination industry in the northeastern city of Dalian. So it's another interesting example in which the universality and Chineseness seem to encounter one another. This leads me to a final image, which ironizes, I hope, some of the things I've discussed so far. It is, of course, a dead representation, both literally and figuratively, since it is not only a still object, but a still object that encodes and reproduces, like the Body World pseudo-sculptures, human corpses. This is a death cast of China. It's one final resting point for their narrative. It is tellingly posed, not by the bunkers themselves, but by the scientists who arranged their bodies after their death. For this reason, its violation of their characteristically self-chosen stance, arms around each other's shoulders, facing outward to the world, the one that appears in nearly all the photographs and lithographs, in favor of a mirrored face-to-face regard, should be understood as an aesthetic gesture, not a medical one. The mirror of the death cast is a mirror that doubles the single. It imagines a single person doubled in an uncanny biological reflection. And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that the figure on the right seems to be trying to look around the figure on the left. While the bunkers preferred pose, so if that pose in some sense, as I say, doubles the single, the bunkers preferred pose singles in some respects. The double, it presents two people together facing the world as a team, a unit. The play reminds us that the death cast is not the last public stance taken by Chang and Eng. It is only one version of an ending and not the one they chose themselves. It is a literal display case. Another ending comes in the annual gatherings of their relatives, an ending which is also beginning, I should add, at their ancestral hometown in North Carolina. And another, of course, is this new play. In it, there are two moments in which Chang and Eng look at themselves in a full-length mirror. Moments in which the audience sees through the mirror, and as I understand in my reading of the play, there's a mirror, it's supposed to be a mirror, but it's actually, there's no mirror in it, so that as they look at themselves in the mirror, they putatively see themselves in the diegesis, but what the audience sees is them looking through a frame at the audience. I could be completely wrong, but that's what I think happens. So two moments in which Chang and Eng look at themselves in a full-length mirror, moments in which the audience sees through the mirror, which is not actually there itself, doubled in Chang and Eng. This invisible mirror doubles the double. Chang and Eng looking at themselves and each other, see us, and we see them. The literal distance, historical, biological, social, individual, between their lives and ours is figured symbolically as a reflection in which we're invited to consider our relationship to the desire to be doubled and the desire to be single. That is why I'm very much looking forward to seeing the performance today. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we're experiencing technical difficulties, but that's my husband. In Ghana, West Africa. I'm not sure what's happening.
Well, it's not part of the talk.
Yeah, we can make it part of the talk. He's here, by the way.
I'm interested.
Sorry. Let me see. I apologize for this, folks. Please, just 1 minute. interesting. In the 26-year wake after Chang Bunker's death in 1874, World's Fairs, where Disney World met the Olympics, met museums, and the latest technological advancements of the day, all within a temporarily constructed city, became the most popular performances of the day. Over 100 million people during this time span would enter these spaces for national and cultural comparison to look and measure their progress against other countries, businesses, scholars, showmen, artists, athletes, and inventors. I turn to World's Fairs not only because of their popularity, but because they heightened and near perfected the performance practices of display and looking at other bodies, which Chang and Ing had experienced earlier in the century. Through human villages or ethnographic displays, other people would live and perform dances, songs, and unusual acts for months at a time in recreated environments akin to the places from whence they hailed. Othered bodies in these spaces were a combination of different races, ethnicities, and rare attributes, advertised using terms like freaks, savages, or curiosities. Whether it was the conquered other via Native Americans like Geronimo, or the freak other like Chiquita, the living doll, who was 26 inches tall and from Cuba, these ethnographic displays operated transnationally in its scope so that perhaps white superiority could ultimately operate across national lines too. But these human villages and World's Fairs come straight out of the traditions of displaying other bodies, thus proving that by the turn of the 20th century, audience still hungered to look at, prod, make fun of, be bewildered by abnormalities, curiosities of people who are different. This desire becomes peculiar when we think of this impact on Black bodies in this space. Like the piece of flesh forever uniting Chang and Ing, the site at which their bond and popularity would take place, forced entanglement is a story of the African diaspora. Those scattered during this time period, primarily by the transatlantic slave trade, yet bonded by a link to a continent ravaged for slaves' gold and resources, and grouped by a color that did not exist in skin, but which nevertheless became the identifying marker of their connection: Blackness. That compulsion to display that tangled history, like Captain Coffin or P.T. Barnum's compulsion to display Chang and Ing, or an eager audience's desire to see that binding flesh, is what makes U.S. World's Fairs compelling and disturbing places in which race and crafted entanglements of Black history and progress were laughed at, pitied, and applauded. The World's Fair, most like the bodily site at which Chang and Ing's bond, popularity, fascination, ridicule, and tension would take place, was the 1901 Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, of all places. Here, African-American visitors were made to look at themselves through the eyes of white showmen, who called them to identify with a savage origin in the form of 98 West and Central Africans living and performing war dances in a recreated village called Darkest Africa, and a frivolous darky minstrel present, via 150 Southern Blacks recreating scenes of a happy slave life in the old plantation display. Both displays were live human villages located in the entertainment section of the fair. Yet the Negro exhibit, co-designed by African-American scholar W.B. Du Bois and championed by the Black Buffalo community, called for the Black American visitor to see and identify with what they called to be the actual status of the colored peoples as a high-achieving race capable of education and progress. And unlike Darkest Africa or Old Plantation, the Negro exhibit was a museum-style display consisting of over 300 Black-authored books, colorful statistical charts from Du Bois' sociological study on Georgia Blacks, more than 600 photographs of the Black middle class, and other visual evidence of Black advancements since the end of slavery. With these three exhibits sharing the same space, the exposition was a performative snare for the Black fairgoer. By enacting such themes as progress and evolution, the Pan-American Exposition pitted the Black Northerner against the Southerner, the educated against the uneducated, and the African American against the African. And if the sign that stood at the fair's entrance was correct when it instructed fairgoers to, please remember, when you get inside the gates, you are a part of the show, then every African American visitor was part of the show and part of this entanglement. The show of a World's Fair was a multi-sensory extravaganza. Although seeing and being seen, to use Tony Bennett's analysis of exhibitionary complexes, is often described as the primary action that took place, the world of a World's Fair and its attempt to both recreate and envision an idealized real world went beyond visual stimuli and invited a totality kind of experience that played on multiple senses for the visitor. Sight, sound, smell, taste, and human interaction all were activated via crafted stagings of human progress. The tangling work of a World's Fair lied in its incorporation of the concept of the ideal. Through a utopic vision of American progress, Pan-American Exposition officials claimed that this fair would illustrate the progress and civilization of the nations of the Western Hemisphere by commemorating the achievements of the 19th century. The best way, that is, the ideal mode of representation, included displaying the United States' latest imperial acquisitions in the forms of human villages containing Filipinos and Native Americans. It also comprised of technological achievements, such as man's ability to harness electrical power from the nearby Niagara Falls in the form of thousands of lights throughout the fairgrounds. Even more conspicuous, the ideal came in the form of social Darwinian lessons via a chromatic arrangement of buildings, signaling man's progression from a less civilized stage to a higher. Moreover, the Pan-American Exposition reveals a more pertinent concept of the term ideal: mental conception embodied. The Pan-American, which, as one writer explained, contained such beautiful displays of man's thoughts, was an exposition of the ideal in this sense. It was, as the Atlantic Monthly wrote, at base philosophic, on the surface theatric. Everything in the fair was essentially the representation of the theories the planners had of themselves, American progress, and other peoples. The problem for African Americans arose when planners decided that the ideal as it pertained to Black participation in America's progress should be in the form of darkest Africa and old plantation, and placed these displays in the midway, the entertainment section of the fair, where everyone went to have fun, going on thrill rides like a trip to the moon, or visiting faraway places like the beautiful Orient, or this should all sound familiar, right? With World's Fairs, one place on this planet gets it the best, and that is Disney World. And yes, I had to go to Disney World and go and check out if I was right in thinking about how this experience was. So I took my college APs, we went to Disney World, and we explored it. Now, for those of you that have gone there, we're not far-fetched. You get a sense of the feeling of different villages, right? You could go to Epcot, and of course, in one day, you can visit, folks in Mexico, folks in Norway. You can cross the border into Canada, all in this recreated sense, that the 1901 Pan American did. This is what Walt Disney wanted to do. He said he wanted to create a World's Fair in perpetuity. And he accomplished that when he went to Orlando and built Epcot. And at night, does anyone know what happens at night at Epcot? Fireworks, and there was a wonderful electrical light display outlining all the buildings. So listen, I'm telling you that if you have to do research on World's Fairs, get a grant and go to Disney World, because then you'll confirm that the experience of back 100 years ago is the same today. All right? Okay, good. All right. So yes, as part of the Pan-Am, darkest Africa and old plantation were ideals, mental conceptions embodied, thought manifested, philosophy performed. So how did these ideals of Black people occur at the Pan American Exposition? How were they crafted entanglements for the African American visitor? Transformed into a legitimate ethnographic field site, Darkest Africa displayed Black Africans as the savage ancestry of African Americans and aimed to highlight the, quote, racial peculiarities and customs of essentially all Black people. This will be the largest and most interesting company of Blacks that has landed in America since slavery days, and in all probability, the last exhibit of wild native life from the tangled jungles of West Africa that will ever be transported to a civilized country. The mastermind behind this concession was a French explorer named Xavier Pennet, who claimed to have lived in Western Africa for 32 years of his life and speak 16 African languages and had brought over other Africans to previous U.S. fairs. The press enthusiastically reported, "He has lived where Livingstone lived, has explored where Stanley penetrated, has been where white men have never been seen." The African village contained about 100 Western Central Africans selected specifically from, quote, those tribes regarded to be the ancestors of the Negro population of this country. Already tangled in the ancestral history of Black Americans, the Africans hailing from present-day Gabon, Benin, Ghana, and Togo lived for 9 months in a space advertised to the public and scientists alike to study real African life in a real African village. Throughout the day, visitors could observe men exhibiting their trade skills in ivory carving and goldsmithing, women cooking and braiding hair, and children carrying out daily tasks or sleeping on their mothers' backs. But unlike any other African village at a previous U.S. World's Fair, Darkest Africa had the official scientific support of the Buffalo Society of Natural Sciences, and one source says the Smithsonian, to secure African artifacts that first appeared in a museum built inside Darkest Africa and that became the property of the society at the end of the exposition. So although situated in the entertainment section of the fair, the Africans were not just entertainers, but subjects ripe for scientific study. And the Americans were not just audience members, but students of anthropology called upon to generate their own scientific theories of African culture. When visitors paid their 20 cents to enter the display, they received an 8-page brochure, a guide to what they should look for and how they should go about analyzing what they see. Copious newspaper coverage of the everyday occurrences in the village proves that the public took its role as students of culture seriously. The papers reported virtually every daily detail of the village. How the Africans handled a gas stove for the first time, the conversion of an African named Umba to Christianity, their wild religious rites, and even African cooking. Darkest Africa was indeed a popular show and quickly became the must-see on the Midway. But the performance that captured the most descriptive accounts was the staged war dance. That wild, unnatural orgy, scientific in detail, I'm quoting, frenzied with passion, the cannibalistic frenzy, which becomes terrifying, and then unbearable.
Motion
Darkest Africa not only claim that African Americans are carriers of savage and animal tendencies, as Minnie Reynolds told us, but that progress in civilization of the African could only happen in their migration to the New World as slaves. And to test such a theory, the visitor could simply leave the thatched gates of Darkest Africa and walk across the street to the old plantation. Whereas Darkest Africa solicited what W.B. Du Bois would call amused contempt from Pax fairgoers, Old Plantation invited amused pity from onlookers who would pay 10 cents to watch emancipated slaves and 2 generations of freeborn Southern blacks reenact scenes of slavery. As part of the Midway, this live display, conceived by E.S. Dundee of Coney Island and Hippodrome fame, was supposed to, quote, amuse and instruct the visitor of what slave life was like in the old plantation before the war. However, those scenes of slave life were not of a slave being whipped nearly to death by an angry overseer, nor were they of families being torn apart. Instead, those recreated scenes were what Sadia Hartman calls reproductions of the bucolic and innocent amusements of slave life. For 7 months, the cast of 150 Southern blacks realized the ideal of the happy-go-lucky darky by first performing camp-style meetings and minstrel shows for the visitor, and second, living in real constructed slave log cabins, picking cotton and singing work songs. Thus, in the liminal space between being laughed at and pitied, the black participants performed an all-round happy and entertaining view of the slave experience. This is a compelling performative moment for this site, because white audience members wanted to witness what they called to be the real ginger of genuine enjoyment these performers possessed, despite knowledge of the horrors of slavery. When the first 72 of the 150 Southern blacks arrived on May 11th, 1901, a Buffalo newspaper noted that among the odd assemblage of mammies who had nursed white children before the war, young bucks of athletic build, and a bunch of funny-looking pickaninnies, there were old grizzled uncles who had felt the lash of the slave owners. And the most famous grizzled uncle in this plantation that was of the most delightful feature, the old uncle who had picked cotton in Dublin, Georgia, and had found his way to Buffalo's old plantation display, was named Laughing Ben Ellington. Nearly 100 years old, 96 years old, he quickly became the most popular performer of the entire plantation. Some sources say of the entire fair, all because of his laugh and the stories that he told.
My master was named Josiah Lander. I was in Dublin, Georgia, on the plantation. That's still where I live right now. I had a good time when I was good, and a bad time when I was bad.
And the newspapers reported that when he had said that line, he doubled over and laughed for a full minute.
time, Jimmy, when I laugh like that.
And the newspaper said that Laughing Ben kept laughing despite the fact no dimes were forthcoming. Crossing Midway Lane was like crossing the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave route Africans had to endure when brought over as slaves, where visitors were to learn that the savages of darkest Africa and the uneducated, amusing darkies from Old Plantation were part of the same progressive and evolutionary narrative. With Old Plantation picking up where darkest Africa left off, the planners behind Old Plantation Darkest Africa constantly reminded the public of the historical associations between Africans and African Americans. I usually get the dime done when I laugh like that. Right across the street from each other, these displays stood. If you looked in the official catalog and guidebook, they were listed next to each other. And my personal favorite is when they had special events like a special tug of war staged between Darkest Africa versus Old Plantation, the outcome of which we do not know. Such crafted entanglements were lessons easily experienced by visitors.
It is unfortunate, but it is true that the majority of the dominant race in this country looks upon the Negro with the lowest and most vicious representatives, opposed to the more intelligent and worthy class.
Yes, Mrs. Terrell, but about a mile away from Darkest Africa and Old Plantation, and in a completely different context, the visitor could find the American Negro exhibit. Seemingly integrated into the more mainstream or serious side of the fair, it was placed in the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, alongside other educational displays from institutions including Harvard, Cornell, and NYU. With this moniker being the American Negro exhibit, the display was Du Bois's illustration of what it would look like to have found a way to be both a Negro and an American, to have found a way to untangle Black folks from the pejorative images of the Midway. Now, Du Bois actually collaborated with one of his best friends from his undergraduate years, Thomas Calloway, to go and collect parts of the exhibits from what we call today historically Black colleges and universities. What's most important is that he went to those college-bred Black Americans whom he called the talented tenth, those who were called to be missionaries of culture amongst their people. And while the Negro exhibit comprised of the same kinds of materials as the displays in its vicinity, his message was a very much animate message for the fairgoer. You know, fairgoers would have to go up to this display and they could pick up a book from the upper shelf, open up charts to look at what Du Bois had studied to be the sociological progress of Black folks in Georgia. They would stoop low to see clay models showing the progress of building Black schools over time, and then they could even pick out those photograph albums and place them on their countertops. What is brilliant about this display is when you take a closer look at even Du Bois's attempts to handwrite every single law in Georgia called the Black Codes that had disenfranchised Blacks from 1732 to the present, or when you take a look at any of the photographs of churches and homes and businesses, and most importantly, people that were represented in his photographic albums, Du Bois was onto something. No labels went along with these photographs, as if saying the truth is clear and evident for itself of Black progress, so why don't you acknowledge that truth, he would say to the American audience. Part of my favorite aspects of this exhibit are the more than 65 charts he created about his sociological study. I mean, looking at everything from crime, religion, education, proving in artistic form the progress of Black folks. An important extension of this display is the fact that you have African American club leaders come to the exposition holding their meetings, and in being a part of the exposition, they too are an extension of the Negro exhibit, a walking, talking embodiment. And I think this is an important extension of this display. And I guess one question that leaves us though with is, given the sheer magnitude of the display, would fairgoers read the exhibit with patience, as Du Bois called for people to do? I'm just not too sure about that. Given the fact that the majority of the 8 million PAX visitors spent much of their time in the entertaining midway, I think that the message of the Negro exhibit may have indeed been lost in the din of the fair. And so what? The key question for me is just what was the African American visitor supposed to think as he or she stood standing before the gates of darkest Africa or plantation? Was his or her response like that of Minnie J. Reynolds?
Nothing else I have ever seen conveys such an impression of wild savagery.
Or was the reaction more like Frederick Douglass in the 1893 Chicago Fair to the African village there?
And as if to shame the Negro, the Dahomians were also there, to exhibit the Negro as a repulsive savage. Measure the Negro, yes, but not by the standard of the splendid civilization of the Caucasian. Bend down and measure him from the depths out of which he has risen.
Undeterred in this time span, Black leaders continuously used World's Fairs to show their worth.
The Negro
Black,
afford
you may be white.
to sulk at every fancied or real insult, but instead, let him show the world his ability, ingenuity, his capacity of the race on every occasion. That speaks louder than trumpet basses. This presentation today is the greatest educator in the world.
Indeed, expositions were the greatest educators of the time, and though we have no archival evidence that Black folks actually went to this fair, we cannot dispute the fact that we have one piece that says, no, they really were there. And I believe when you throw in the fact of willful Black participation, then the exposition was a powerful space, not only because it could erect and destroy beautiful buildings in a second, but because it could turn ideals into reality, making African American visitors who went to that exposition leave it thinking that they must disassociate and so forth. That these must be ideals that must be battled against if white Americans were going to see Blacks as a capable people to untangle themselves from that narrative. And this was the war. For even though the Grand Pan Am grounds are now just Delaware Park in Buffalo, the manufacturers and liberal arts building which housed the Negro exhibit is now a residential neighborhood. And the sites of darkest Africa and Old Plantation turned into warehouses and a parking lot with my rental car. The warring ideals and disassociations present within the Black community did not crumble into nothing at the close of the Pan American Exposition. Rather, they persisted throughout much of the 20th century. And I would argue, unto this very day.
You may be black, you may be white, you may be wrong, you may be right, but when the Lord gets ready, you gotta move. You may be high, you may be low, you may be down, no place to go. But when the Lord gets ready, you gotta move. You gotta move, child. You got to move. You gotta move, child. gotta move. But when the law gets ready, gotta move.
One of the best musicians in the Bay Area, Philip Kan Gotanda, in the Department of English.
Thank you, Amma. Thank you to all of the students and collaborators. As we find our seats again, and some of you start to think about posing questions to our panelists, maybe I'll start things off by asking panelists if they have either of you has a question that you want to ask someone on the panel.
I'd like to thank whoever thought of putting me in stand before Amma.
I'd like to, of course, second that. And also assure Eric that his account of the scene of the full-length mirror in I Dream of Chang'an is accurate. It works on stage the way it works on the page, but of course even more powerfully because the two actors playing Chang'an are on the other side of the frame that has no mirror in it, looking in the mirror, supposedly seeing their own reflection, but actually looking at the audience who is looking at them, and then they step through the mirror toward the audience. That scene on the page or on the stage, it seems to me could serve as an emblem for the various talks today, which have been in different ways been about whatever called Dublin.
Do we have a question ready from the audience? Yes, thank you.
I think this is a question I guess for Dr. Otter. I guess I didn't realize until your presentation that Chang'an, when they became plantation owners, that they had a plantation that had enslaved people associated with it, and thus became slave owners. And so the immediate question that popped into my mind was, I was thinking about many of the students who were enslaved, and I wondered if at any point those two trajectories intersected their lives, the two pairs of young twins, slave owner and slave.
I'm not aware, maybe Ellen Samuels knows, I'm not aware of the answer to that question about the two pairs of conjoined twins encountering one another. In terms of your question about the ownership of slaves, Gotanda scripts and the people put on the production stage not only a discussion between Chang'an, who have different opinions about the ownership of slaves, but also the scene I referred to without giving any details. There's an extended scene that has to do with Chang'an being mistaken for Native Americans and almost lynched, and a scene that in its wider resonances invokes the Asian American People versus Hall case, and African American slavery as well. It's also the case, another way of answering your question is to say, or two other things to observe are, the Chang'an story, whatever we might want to turn it into, resists some simple account of the other, since you have the born in Siam to Chinese parents who come to the U.S. They're conjoined twins. They brilliantly stages these kinds of complications. And as a speaker earlier today said, Gotanda resists some simple choice in the narrative in terms of casting heroes and villains. And then just one other way to answer the question is to say that in the play I Dream of Chang'e, and in Twain's novel, Pudd'nhead Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins, as time unfolds, the story of the conjoined twins becomes layered with the story of race and slavery in the U.S. So the two parts of Twain's story, one is about conjoined twins, Italian twins in that case. The other story is about racially indistinguishable babies switched at birth, who grow up, a murder is involved, and execution and return to slavery follow. So it's not only on the biographical level with Chang and Eng, but writers then and now articulate the connections between the twin story and a racially twin story.
Can I just add, and one thing I want to say about Chang and Eng is that, and the play talks about this briefly, is that the legal status of Asian Americans or of Asians in the United States, and their placement within kind of hierarchy of race, their legal relation to the sort of concept of citizenship gets established much later than Chang and Eng's life in some sense, and so one of the ironies of the story of Chang and Eng and their placement, and even the relation between their family and the notions of Asian Americans, which was a question we had in the previous panel, are made odd partly because the category of the Asian is so is in some sense waiting to be codified in law and in the public opinion later on, and that only really happens beginning in the 1880s or the 1870s, and then in law much later on, and so that's part of the strange status of this play and the relationship between ethnicity and biology, which is also obviously a kind of double that figures or anticipates the problem of race as a concept that goes both in the ethnic and biological directions at various moments in American history.
And even just to tag along on that, to my understanding, in conversations with Philip Gotanda, that the category that existed for Chang and Eng when they first came to the U.S., they categorized as color. Is that correct? So this idea that there's an entanglement that they find themselves in thinking about slavery, thinking about blackness, thinking about that's the category that fits them when they first come in, and then to think how they untangle themselves out of that.
What it is when they first arrive, they don't have a category, so they're deemed white, not black.
Right.
And then gradually the law changes where they are considered colored.
Right.
Or Indian. So that's their perspective.
And I think it's interesting to then think about how untangling may happen after that.
Last question from Colleen, and we'll take a break. Yeah.
So maybe just to follow through on this really interesting line of thinking about ethnographic recovery through present day, you could say Asian American work or African American performative work, right? So just trying to think through this puzzle here. I was wondering whether Eric and Amma could say a little bit more maybe on a couple of points that might fit in your presentations that slogan, what you think Gotanda does with that as a way to think about that third worldism. I know that seems complicated. But then alongside that, Amma, I was wondering whether, because you didn't say too much specifically about Gotanda's play, maybe you were in a position also not to have seen it beforehand, so maybe just offering the description is difficult. How would you compare your performative recuperation and sort of subversion, right, of world fair tonality and, sort of ethnographic display in your own performance to Gotanda's, historiographic recovery of this period of, when Asian and Black racialization are kind of entangled? That's kind of a messy question, but just pointing to 2 points, it seems to me, in your presentations that could bring out that issue.
So the simple answer I have is that I will see the play tonight, which is why everyone should see the play tonight before it closes this weekend. And my encounter with the play was during a reading of a previous draft, so I'm not sure what changes have taken place. So I really want to see that tonight, then I can speak on it.
I have 2 things to say. I mean, first of all, with the Mao and the Spice Girls, I was trying to do 2 different things. One, as you're right, is to evoke the kind of the presence and the importance of the kind of Mao's emphasis on the splittist dialectic and the necessity for continuous revolution at a crucial moment of Asian American history, which, and again, as you know, one of the really striking things about Asian American studies is that it begins in a really intensely third worldist moment and then sheds, I think, over the course of the mid to late 70s, that third worldism, and by the 80s has really become a US-oriented move, and the transnational turn in Asian American studies has not, it seems to me, adequately recuperated either the actual history of Asian American studies in that respect, or in fact the energy that was guaranteed by the Third World Project or the Third Worldist impulse here at Berkeley in that moment. So there's that. The other thing I was trying to hint at was this kind of moment that really struck me in the book One of Us, which Cindy referred to, which I read, in which she talked about how she was talking about a musical involving other conjoined twins, in which 2 conjoined twins sing a song that seems like it's it's about being a twin, but it's also about being in love. And I wanted to invoke with the Spice Girls, because of course that song is about, get a little bit closer, baby, get it on tonight, it's not. And so, there's that moment where it's about love, and it's about being in touch with someone's body, and the way that they touch your body, and are both simultaneously knowing and learning, getting to know your body, but maybe they already know your body. And I think that's it's a part of the conjoined twin story that seems to me worth also recuperating. I mean, the play begins with the moment of violence where Chang is strangling Peng. But you realize how much simple caressing and care also goes on in that relationship. I think that can be, put in a kind of saccharine, slightly narcotic context, as we saw in the Life magazine photo. But it seems to me weirdly that the play and the issue is, bizarrely and almost freakishly connected to that double, which is a double that's very much involved with Asian American history also, and the problem of love and of 2 being 1, which we all think about, which is in a million songs. I don't know what to say. I mean, how do I bring together this? If I were awesome, I would be able to now bring together love and Asian America, but I can't. So I think we'll just wait for the play tonight to handle that problem.
Well, for someone who hasn't seen the play yet, Eric's disquisition on it is pretty incredible. What I want to thank our panelists, thank all of the collaborators. We'll take a quick break and return with 3 of the artists who put this project together, where we can, I think, ask a bunch more questions that are no doubt still lingering for all of you. So a quick break, and we'll reconvene in about 7 minutes.
behind the way, right?